So, yeah, I want to talk about Mankiw's book and how did I get into the discussion with this Mankiw book. I started about 1 year ago a series of tweets called Best of Mankiw, and they attracted so much interest in the Twitter community that I thought to present it in a more coherent way. And so why is it so important to deal with Mankiw and also with introductory books? I think it's obvious that introductory textbooks shape the mindset of students. There's this saying, there's no second chance to make a first impression. One can go even further and show that textbook revolutions are an important element of scientific revolutions. There's a very interesting paper by Kolander and Landre. And of course, Mankiw's book is the world's best-selling textbook in the world, so it definitively is something that matters. So what's wrong with this textbook? And I would say there are three main points of criticism. First, they give a flawed or at least biased presentation of the role of government in the economic system. And one could say the motto of this presentation is the famous saying by Ronald Reagan, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. And I will show in the following some examples where exactly this view is presented by Mankiw. Second, there is a flawed presentation of the role of the financial system in Mankiw's books, and there's also a confusing presentation of Keynesian theory. I'm not sure whether we can touch all these points within the 15 minutes I've been assigned, but let's go a little bit through it. So let's start with the role of government. And in Mankiw's book, he presents 10 principles, 10 commandments, so to say. And one of the commandments is governments can sometimes improve market outcomes. And in reading the book, you can find, I would say, really astonishing sentence by Mankiw saying, the invisible hand does not ensure that everyone has sufficient food, decent clothing, and adequate health care. And what follows from this, from Mankiw, he says, this inequality may, depending on one's political philosophy, call for government intervention. I must say I found that really shocking that one can say in an introductory book, it's not a necessity for the government to do something if people do not have sufficient food, decent clothing, and adequate healthcare. So that was a quite shocking start when I looked in this book. So, and it goes on if you look at principle 1 presented by Mankiw, and the principle says people face trade-offs. And again, I want to quote what he says. When government redistributes income from the rich to the poor, it reduces the reward for working hard. As a result, people work less and produce fewer goods and services. In other words, that's his conclusion, when the government tries to cut the economic pie in more equal slices, the pie gets smaller. And this is, again, quite astonishing statement because it says if the government tries to provide for a more fair income distribution in the economy, it means that the pie gets smaller. In other words, one can say what Mankiw wants to say, the higher the inequality in the economy, the bigger gets the pie. And this is, of course, not a very, very correct statement, because when we look at the inequality in the world, and so and if you ask ourselves, how is it if the slice, if they are smaller or bigger slices, the countries with the highest degree of inequality are obviously not countries where the pie is really big. So a high degree of inequality can be observed in South Africa, in Costa Rica, Chile, Turkey, Bulgaria, and these are definitively not the country where the pie is especially big. And on the other hand, if the pie is divided more equally, especially in the Scandinavian countries, we all know that these are countries that are very productive, that have very high GDPs per capita. And so this statement, more inequality is good for the economic performance, is obviously completely incompatible with the reality. Then a further statement, also a very important point, where again one can see the main idea of Mankiw, that government interference causes always problems. I think that's his message. And here he presents the example that a minimum wage causes unemployment with a very simple micro diagram of the labor market. And when people see this, so they come obviously to the result that whenever you have a minimum wage, that must lead to unemployment. But we definitively know that this is not the case. Nobel Prize winner Card has shown this quite impressively with many empirical studies, that there's absolutely no necessity for a minimum wage to cause unemployment. And of course, this needs a more elaborate model of the labor market. You need a model of the labor market with the monopsony on the side of labor demand. Astonishingly, Mankiw has the monopsony model of the labor market in his book, but he makes no attempt to relate the monopsony model to minimum wage. So the reader of Mankiw's book definitively comes to the result: whenever you have a minimum wage, you will cause unemployment. So better no minimum wage. Another example, which is a little bit more complicated, and so maybe I can only give you the general idea. When Mankiw discusses government deficits, he comes to the very blunt statement: government budget deficits reduce the economy's growth rate, which is quite a strong statement. And he explains it with the flow of funds model, which I cannot elaborate here. But the whole result depends on the implicit assumption that whenever government runs a deficit, it uses the deficit for consumption. If you change this very simple assumption and you assume that the government uses the deficit for investment, you can, with the same model, I don't like the model, but even with this model, you can say that government budget deficits have a positive effect on economic growth. So another example where the government is not the solution, where the government is the problem. And what is really striking is when Mankiw talks about macroeconomics. And here's a very simple model, the ASAD model, with which you are familiar. And here he shows that when you have a fall in aggregate demand, the price level falls, and then the economy automatically comes back to full employment. And the message here is deflation is stabilizing the economy, or in other words, you don't need the government to stabilize the economy if you have demand shocks. It's all self-stabilizing. Another really impressive statement if we know what terrible consequences deflation had in the past. So let me come to another important area: the role of financial markets, the role of the banking system. And here, Mankiw, like many other textbooks, suffer from a completely flawed model of the macroeconomy. And this model assumes that banks collect deposits, quote Mankiw, from people who want to save, and use these deposits to make loans to people who want to borrow. So the idea is banks are simple intermediaries between savers and borrowers, a completely flawed model which has nothing to do with the reality, and which is, in my view, one of the explanations why economists had such a hard time to explain and to forecast the financial market crisis. And of course, the relevant approach is that banks create deposits, and this is now widely acknowledged by many central banks. Of course, it's not widely acknowledged in the academic community. So if Mankiw has this flawed presentation of banks, can justify it by saying that this flawed model is used also in many in many very sophisticated macroeconomic models. Let me skip that and let me come to the end. So I would say teaching is really important. Unfortunately, in the daily academic business, it's a kind of stepchild. The importance of teaching in textbooks is underrated. You do not get any scores in academic rankings if you write textbooks, which require a huge input of time. And I think that's the explanation why this Mankiw textbook is so successful, because most younger researchers think it's a waste of time to invest in teaching, and they just take what is there. And this explains why Mankiw, and I think there are other textbooks which are similarly flawed. I think also the macroeconomics textbook by Mishkin, and also the macro textbook by Blanchard is not a textbook which adequately explains what is going on in the macroeconomy, especially what's going on in the financial system. There are more modern approaches. I think the core team book is very good. For the German audience, I have introductory textbook, which is now in the 5th edition. And so if you are interested in a new course in macroeconomics, so I have developed a completely new macroeconomics course this summer, which was funded by INET. So thank you very much to INET. And you can get, it's a series of about 10 to 12 lectures. You can get all the lectures, you can get all the teaching materials if you use this QR code. And I would really be happy if you could have a look at it. And I'm also, of course, interested in all kinds of comments. And finally, if you want to know more about my Mankiw critique, which was definitively a little bit short, under these QR codes, you find my tweets related to Mankiw. You also find discussion that I had with Mankiw, which was quite interesting. And you also find the text that I've written for INET, where I explain this in more detail. Okay, thank you very much. I know it was very short, but I hope you somehow got the idea of what I wanted to present. And if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. Thank you very much for your attention.